The other day, I took my son to the dentist to have a cavity filled. He's in 5th grade, the apex of curiosity. First came the mask for the nitrous. He asked, "What's this?" They explained. Then the numbing gel. More questions, more clarity. This went on back and forth for a bit while they waited. He watched the TV in the ceiling, just like when we were kids. Then I saw his hand reach out, fingers flailing, looking for mine to squeeze, and I was right there. When he could finally speak, he gasped out, "What was that pain?" The assistant replied, "It's to numb you." "Didn't you already do that?" he asked. "We do a deeper numbing into the gum." "But why did it hurt like that?" "Because of the pockets." "What pockets?" I was close enough so that I could see the syringe they used, and I interrupted. "Do you mean because of the needle?" The assistant and dentist looked from one to another, concerned and startled by my apparent potty mouth. "We don't say that word here. We don't want kids to associate it with the dentist." At the end of the appointment, they told me that they would note in the file that we can use, quote, honest, real language with the child. Wait, what? When did reflecting reality to our kids become so problematic that euphemisms and allusion become an acceptable replacement for facts? And that is what we are going to tackle today. Back in the 1900s, after you took your SATs, colleges and universities would flood your parents' actual, literal mailbox with brochures and catalogs. While this sounds like a barrage of garbage, it was in fact very wanted and welcome because back then the only other way to know about colleges was in your guidance counselor's office, the local public library, or if you bought the annual guide yourself. There was no look it up online. The one that I was obsessed with was Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. As a city girl, the beauty of the buildings and the nearness to the beach in those glossy, full-color photos were the dream. I never even toured it or applied until I moved local. My guest today is a professor, speaker, writer, and the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History and Humanities Department Chair at the Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. Welcome, Dr. Michael Butler.
Thank you for having me, Susie. That's going to be hard to top because what I bring to the table definitely does not match the exterior that attracted you to St. Augustine.
Dubious. Before I got that brochure, I had never even heard of St. Augustine. And to be honest, I never even thought about it again until 2012, when I read a letter called Why We Went.
Absolutely.
So I do a lot of generational trauma work and Jewish history, reading and dedicating, right? We go back to some stories that have gotten lost over time because they weren't deemed important or significant enough. And so here I am today, raising my family. And as I take my weekend trips to our backyard, I am experiencing living history. And you have the privilege to work there. So tell me a little bit about St. Augustine.
Oh, wow. It is a daily validation of why I chose the right career. When I was hired 14 years ago, believe it or not, at Flagler, they wanted to fill a void within their history program. And that void was someone who specialized in the civil rights movement so that they could highlight what happened in 1964 particularly. So yeah, I was aware of St. Augustine through my readings and through my studies in graduate school and beyond about the civil rights movement and the impact St. Augustine had. But the reason that I said that this is sort of an embodiment of why I chose the right career path is because since I have come to Flagler, the amount that I have learned about the local movement has increased almost year by year so that it gives me a much more well-rounded story that I can give to students, to podcast hosts, to listeners like you have, so that they can appreciate that history is not something that happens in a textbook that's remote, that history is something that happens literally in your backyard, that has importance on the local, state, and national levels.
It's interesting. So many years ago, I had the privilege of doing walking tours as a summer in Israel experience. And what they would have you do is take the Bible out, and you would walk around the country with the Bible, and they would say, okay, read that, and that's where we're standing. That's where this happened. And I find the same spirituality, I'll call it, in St. Augustine when I walk around, whether it's reflecting back to the Native Americans or back to the conquistadors. There is this strong tie to history that keeps bringing us to this tiny little spot. So where are you from originally, and was it a historically significant space in the world?
Originally, I'm from Mobile, Alabama. I know that probably threw the listeners. I say all the time that I'm from L.A., Lower Alabama. So
I'm from up north, northern Georgia.
There you go. There you go. We won't talk about northern Georgia these days. But the historical significance here, being from the Gulf Coast, being from Mobile, being from a place that was settled by the French for so long, and being aware of Pensacola, my interest in history has always been there, right? It goes back, like all of us do, those moments when we're kids and something piqued your interest and you're like, wow, that's really interesting. I want to learn more about that. So, being local from Mobile, I thought that an institution like Spring Hill College was too far removed. I received a scholarship to go there, ended up getting my bachelor's in history at Spring Hill, which in and of itself is a historic campus, right? The oldest university in Alabama.
Right.
Knew that I wanted to study the history of the South because it's where I'm from. It's what I knew. I was always interested in who we are, how do we get there, and how does it fit into the grander themes of American history, and that's why I ended up at the University of Mississippi. So I did my master's and doctorate at Ole Miss and learned really fast that if you don't understand the Civil Rights Movement, you don't understand the contemporary South, much less contemporary America. Being able to attend a program like the history department at Ole Miss was transformative because of what happened in 1962. James Meredith. You can either ignore that it happened or you can lean into it. And what the history program did while I was there was lean into it. So everything revolved around the Civil Rights Movement and how transformative it was, both for the people who lived it and the legacies moving forward. So from there, the more I learned about the Civil Rights Movement, the more I realized, number one, I knew nothing. Number two, the more interested I was in the topic. So it became the emphasis of my own research, my dissertation, my book now, which is about the Civil Rights Movement in Pensacola, Florida, not far from where, I grew up. And, that's sort of how I developed my interest in the topic and got to actually fill that void at Flagler with teaching the Civil Rights Movement, with St. Augustine's role in it, and have even developed a course on the Civil Rights Movement in Florida because of this concept called Florida exceptionalism, Susie. It's the idea that somehow Florida did not have a civil rights movement because it's exceptional when you look at the rest of the South, that Florida is sunshine, Mickey Mouse, immigrants, open for business. When we look a little deeper, what we realize is that no, the Florida model is not just part of the Southern experience, but if you look at the Florida model in terms of race relations, it sets a pattern, it sets a blueprint that the rest of the nation follows. One of my favorite documentarians, Billy Corbin, often says that the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. And nowhere is that more clear than when looking at the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement and how putting up barriers to meaningful racial progress was really developed in this state.
Okay. You said some very important things, and I want to lean into them. For me, the study of any inequity is personal. Generational trauma. All four of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and so marginalization of people is personal. It's not something that's a textbook example for me. And so when you think back, being from Mobile, which is a hotbed of civil rights activity, whether pro or against, do you have a personal connection through your family, through your own history, that said to you, stand up, speak out?
No. At least in terms of this history, in terms of doing what's right, yes. That's where the textbook and the personal morality come together, right? Look, I remember growing up in a little working class town, Chickasaw, Alabama, living in an apartment complex with 4 other families around us. One of the first things that really had an impact on me in terms of contemporary society was what is often called the last lynching in American history. And it's not, by the way. I've learned that that's not true, but the lynching of Michael Donald in Mobile. Mm-hmm. Literally 500 yards from my front doorstep in the early 1980s, there was a march by the Ku Klux Klan. This was not ancient history to me.
Did you see it?
No.
Did you read about it?
We actually went to my grandparents' house who lived in Saraland, which is about 5 miles north of Chickasaw, just in case, quote unquote, that mess started.
So there was an awareness.
Oh yeah, there was an awareness that we are going because the Klan's going to be here. Oh gosh, I was probably 8, 9.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, being on a Dixie youth baseball team, in which, by the way, my students are always surprised by this. We had to wear the little Confederate flag patches on our baseball uniforms. Having someone whose father was a blatant, unrepentant Klan member who wore the Burning Cross belt buckles to baseball games and let it be known that there would be no black people on his daughter's team. Yeah, all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. When looking back, it's formative. Now, you said something as well, Susie, about how generational trauma and your family history had an impact. This is where I will say that one of the things that makes history, in my opinion, different and more valuable is that it's one of the only subjects, in my opinion, in which you can learn empathy. And you learn empathy in history by reading about and listening to the experiences of others whose path is not yours. I can't relate to stories of being the son of Holocaust survivors. But what history teaches us is that if we go by the documents and the evidence and we listen to people, then we can relate. Even though we may not have that in common, I can at least understand, comprehend, and become a witness moving forward about why those stories are indeed significant. So similarly, the more that I've learned about the civil rights movement and put with my past and coupled with your insight about bearing witness to trauma, that is what studying history is all about. And that's what it does for students who study topics that, number one, they may have thought they had no interest in, and then they realize they do. But they realize that, therefore, but through the grace of God go I. And they can put themselves in the positions, in the shoes of people who they would have thought they had nothing in common with. Now that's, do all students have that experience? Do all people have that experience? I mean, look around. No, quite frankly. But for those who want to really immerse themselves in the study of a topic, you can't help but feel empathy for people who struggle for their basic constitutional rights in a country that we ask to do better for all citizens.
I happen to agree. I also happen to believe very strongly that people's perception or their reality and our own personal history is what informs the way we navigate our future. So it sounds like when you're thinking back, the belt buckle, the Confederate flag on the uniform, these sort of shaped what you thought were like, should I be bitter or better moments in your life where, you as they add up over the years, you have the decision if you're surrounded by these people, right? Because there's one of each.
Oh, yeah.
For every belt buckle that's a burning cross, there had to have been somebody whose strong moral compass and guiding values were saying something to little Michael. Were you Mikey or Michael?
No, I was Michael. I was little Mike.
Little Mike.
Junior.
Little Mike.
Yeah, little Mike.
Okay, so
You got to work on the accent.
Just my accent.
No, when you say little Mike.
Little Mike.
Yeah. Okay.
Is
that's
it
close.
Mike? I'm just saying, see, this right here, this is the racial relationship we're talking about, the northern-southern.
That's right.
We're learning to deal with each other and empathize by understanding that we speak a different language.
Right.
It's really just a different accent.
Right.
And essentially it comes down to the same thing, right? I can't possibly understand what a boy from Mobile, Alabama could have experienced growing up, which sounded terrifying right now, what you described to me, but it sounds, by the way, very similar to what Kristallnacht sounded like to my grandmother when she told me that story. And it sounds very similar to acts of rage that we see happening today in modern times. So I don't like to think that I'm overly sensitive. I just think that based on history, I like to keep my finger on the pulse of what's, like you said, if we don't keep watch, these things will happen again. So let's come back to St. Augustine. And in June of 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King got arrested and jailed in St. Augustine. And he contacts his friend, Rabbi Israel Dresner, to recruit support.
Yes.
What happened?
Wow, that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to something that you said, and I'm going to push back on just a tad.
Sure.
Perception is reality. It is until you actually view the primary sources. We can have our own perceptions, and Lord knows I did when I was a kid. Was there anyone to push back against the reality? Maybe, maybe not. But when you are faced with, this is what these groups stood for, and here are the documents, the letters that are written that explain a perspective, then you have a choice to make. If the facts don't line up with your perception, you can either blame the facts or you can change your perception.
So let's go back to my story at the beginning. The facts, the experience, it was all the same. My son went to the dentist. They were honest with him until they felt that he wasn't ready for it. Two strangers to my child chose to sugarcoat this experience for him. And I stepped in to explain to them that facts and reality are just existence and experience. Why would you proactively zhuzh it up, right? Tell me if the kid is scared. I'll let you know if you need to be sensitive to him. But so this is where we come to today, where I feel like the facts and the history, they're there. The needle is there. How we're presenting that to the public is the question. I like facts. And then we can make the determination. But at least if there's the history there, you're right. Now you have to show your source. Cite me two sources, in fact, because I don't typically go for the first one. Right. I need two sources. But that means that we have to first bring up the needle, right? He said out loud, that hurt. Why did that hurt? And they gave these roundabout reasons that still didn't make sense to a 10-year-old, right?
Right.
So kids aren't stupid. Let's go back to who we need to teach this history and education for. We did macro.
We are. And we will get to the micro.
Let's do the macro.
Absolutely.
Okay, so 1964. Why is that important?
Quick question, maybe we can come back to this later. Did your son get mad at the needle? No.
No.
He got mad at the people who lied to him about the needle.
Yes, in fact.
Our students can handle the truth. And when you give them the truth based on primary sources, you don't have to call a wrong a wrong. I don't have to editorialize. Students can reach their own conclusion. They don't get mad at the sources. They get mad at their prior teachers and their parents and other people who they asked, why didn't you tell me this story? I grew up here.
One of the best stories I've ever heard in my life was at the LJD, Jewish Family and Community Services. They have the Frisch Family Holocaust Gallery, and they do tours. They had a tour from UNF of students, and there was a girl in that tour who, an hour into the tour, crumbled to her feet, and she said, my parents have been lying to me the whole time. The Holocaust is real. So these moments are happening, and this is a young adult in her 20s, and this is in 2023 that these experiences are taking place. And I can assure you that the moment that we're developing this ability to cater to our growing population of smart thinkers, are we catering to the lowest common denominator or the highest common denominator? Are we telling them what they should hear and then they can figure it out? Or are we giving them the Cliff Notes version and sort of leaving the fill in the blanks?
Or even more directly, are we trying to protect them, or are we trying to protect ourselves by not telling the story and being honest with the past?
So go back to that story, because there's historically this impactful relationship between the Black and the Jewish community.
Yes.
And it's gone one of two ways. I'm a New Yorker, native New
Yes.
Yorker, and I've said in the past that growing up in this microcosm of what growing New York City was in the 70s and 80s, we were all first-generation immigrants, and we were all friends, and we all got along, and we all got together until Tawana Brawley and the Crown House riots.
Yes.
And that's when there was a general shift. And while us children played outside, we were never allowed into each other's homes, and our parents didn't really speak again after that. There was never another block party. Okay? So when you say looking at Florida tells you the history of the United States, for me, looking at New York City and its shift has always shown me what the shift in the United States looks like, right? There's different viewpoints. So here, I get to the South. It's the first place I see a Confederate flag.
Yep.
It's the first place I see a swastika, and I've been to concentration camps, okay, in Jacksonville, Florida. But I go to St. Augustine, and it's also one of the most prolific unifications of two marginalized communities who come together to really provide where civil rights is born.
Yeah.
So, tell us the story.
The story is 1964. You can actually go back beyond 64, because one of the things that I stress is that the civil rights movement doesn't begin nor end with one group or one person, right? Local people make history. The bravery of local people is what gives a stage for groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. King, okay? There was a movement in St. Augustine for equality, anti-Jim Crow, integration before 1964. But 1964 has national significance because SCLC had a much broader perspective of what they were trying to accomplish. And what they were trying to accomplish was passage of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was making its way through Congress. It would be one piece of legislation that, with the president's signature, would wipe out segregation totally. So this came as a result of Birmingham in 63. King and SCLC realized that, instead of fighting city by city and area by area, that we can get presidential support for one piece of legislation to end it all. So it's the nuclear option, right? It's instead of fighting these skirmishes, we can wipe it out. Well, the thing about it is that most senators from the South, all senators, all legislators are Democrats. So they are going to hold up the Civil Rights Act. And it was indeed the longest filibuster in U.S. history that was occurring to block passage of the Civil Rights Act. Shift focus to St. Augustine.
Right.
What is going on in St. Augustine is that SCLC has mobilized because they have been asked to come to this community by local people because the violence is so intense. It's nightly. The racism is so significant. It existed in government, it existed in policing, it existed in paramilitary white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. So you have this, as Dr. King called it when he came, magnificent drama that's unfolding in St. Augustine. The big picture is the Civil Rights Act. In its waning days as a filibuster, it was determined that there would be an arrest, that Dr. King, just like he did in Birmingham, would be arrested for trying to integrate a segregated facility, and it happened to be the Monson Motor Lodge for a variety of reasons, right? One of the things, Susie, about the movement is the more you learn about it, the more you learn that nothing happened accidentally or
there's no coincidence.
There's no coincidence.
Everything is staged and well thought out. When somebody wants to affect change, they do it.
And well organized.
Oh, so brilliant.
So
tell us how it went down,
How it went. He tried to get in, is arrested. This is June 11, 1964.
Yeah.
He is in the St. Johns County jail and did as he had often done, as SCLC had often done, they asked for outside assistance. Where did they turn? They turned to the progressive Jewish community.
Jewish geography, we call it.
Cy Dresner. Someone who had helped him in Albany, someone who was with him at the March on Washington just a few months earlier. He asked in his letter for a minimum of 30 volunteers. 17 came.
From the Central Conference of American Rabbis.
That's right. And that conference had their annual convention just days after, and Rabbi Dresner read Dr. King's letter. And he even said that the tone was different. Probably because he perceived that the stakes were higher because they were.
Yes.
So, fast forward. June 17, 6 days after Dr. King's arrest. 16 rabbis and 1 associate, so 17 total, come to St. Augustine. You see, these are the details that you learn as sort of you go. And they participated in the nightly mass march, the march to the plaza in St. Augustine.
Linked arm in arm.
Linked arm in arm, but in pairs of 2 for reasons that are really interesting when you do the ground tour. But anyway, one of the rabbis said it was the most frightened he'd ever been in his life when they actually got to ground zero and saw the amount of hate, because the only thing worse than being an N-word in the South at this time is being an N-word lover. And these people were called white N-words Jews. That was the phrase. So the next day, the plan was, as the filibuster was coming to an end, Dr. King had alerted the media there would be a swim-in at the Monson Motor Lodge. These rabbis, their associate, and several other people, by the way. Yes, what happens on June 18? Spoiler alert, the largest mass arrest of Jewish rabbis to this day in American history. It was the distraction because they asked to pray, and you see the footage, you see the pictures that were in the New York Times of the owner of the Monson Motor Lodge, Jimmy Brock, grabbing the rabbis, pushing them toward officers saying, arrest him, arrest him. They're chanting the 23rd Psalm when all of a sudden Jim Brock hears splashes in the pool. 2 white SCLC members had checked into the Motor Lodge, and they invited as guests 5 members of SCLC. They were all black. This is when the plan came into place, right? This is what gives us the infamous picture of Mr. Brock grabbing 2 gallons of muriatic acid, pouring it in the pool. Now, one of the people who was in the pool, J.T. Johnson, I've had the opportunity to talk with him before about this. He was a lifeguard, and he was saying, it's not going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt you. It's just cleaner. But the face, the black face that you see in the pool that is shrieking, they don't know that.
I don't know that. It's acid. It says acid on it.
It is acid, and he's saying it as he's pouring it in.
We know now that even if he would have dumped the entire amount in, it would have been diluted by the water in there. But the intent, that's what we want to go back to, the intent.
That's right.
The intent of the rabbis being arrested to distract so that those people could jump in the pool was intentional. The intent of that man to pour acid to scare and terrify was intentional.
Intentional.
We have choices in life. Some are better, some are worse. But that picture, that photograph, what was the monumental stakes there?
The next day. Okay, so number one, you have these pictures of Jimmy Brocken grabbing Rabbi Dresner by the arm in the New York Times the next day. You had the image of a plainclothes officer jumping into the pool to get them out.
With his gun.
Yes.
Yep.
On the front page of the Washington newspaper, the morning that the vote for the Civil Rights Act was held, was James Brock pouring the acid into the pool. And what had happened in St. Augustine is that it had gone from a cautionary tale in terms of we want to avoid racial unrest. Look at what's happening in St. Augustine. It actually became, look at what's happening in St. Augustine. You have terrified black faces and a white angry person pouring acid into a pool. That's what this act is meant to reverse. So, one of those surreal moments in my life, seeing James McGovern and Andrew Young talk about this and what SCLC wanted to accomplish in St. Augustine. George McGovern says, yes, we were talking about that on the floor of the Senate the next morning. So would the act have passed? Probably. Most likely. Did St. Augustine have an impact on the urgency of the vote at that moment in time? Absolutely. So that night, the night of the 18th, while the rabbis were in prison, in jail in St. Johns County, they decided to write a letter that answered a simple question. Why did you go? Now the letter is why we went. Mm-hmm. And they outlined it. And for a variety of reasons, Andrew Young, who was one of Dr. King's lieutenants in SCLC, called it the Jewish equivalent of the letter from Birmingham jail, where they said, for morality, for history, for patriotism, for faith is why they came to St. Augustine. And I think it is a monumental example of why speaking out and being a witness for people who may not have the voice that you do is important in historical times like these.
So I'm going to read an excerpt from that letter, Why We Went, from 1964. We shall not forget the people with whom we drove, prayed, marched, slept, ate, demonstrated, and were arrested. We are grateful for the rare experience of sharing with this courageous community their life, their suffering, their effort. We pray that we remain more sensitive and more alive as a result.
Yeah.
Inherently, the reason that I am still a student of history and that I am a firm and staunch proponent of my children learning the real language is so that when we go back through the long arc of history, we can connect what helps us as a society to thrive and that we can prevent what creates the chaos. So, I didn't have the opportunity to see you speak, but I did have the opportunity to do the walking tour. Tell us about your book.
Oh, my goodness. Pensacola, Florida. The big picture is, in all of these stories, communities had to go back to living with each other in the aftermath of these traumatic times. Mm. St. Augustine, I think what happens beyond 64 is just as important as what happens in 64. Pensacola is a microcosm of that, in my opinion, because during the 1960s, the community there went through what I would call an average integration process, an average desegregation process. But in the 1970s, all hell broke loose. And it revolved around two issues: the killing of an unarmed black motorist by police in the presence of Confederate iconography at a local high school. Stop me if you've heard this before.
It sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
It's an annual occurrence.
It is. The question of whether or not the civil rights was over for many white leaders was settled. It's done. However, African American leaders in Pensacola, in the black community who supported them in Pensacola, said no. The movement has not ended. The movement has evolved. It's changed. Instead of combating laws, we're now combating practices. And there's a difference. In the scholarship, it's the difference between de jure segregation and de facto racism. We're still dealing with the consequences.
It's generational trauma. It's the generational trauma of the people experiencing it and the generational trauma of the people who are perpetrating it,
yes.
right? Nobody's raised in a vacuum.
Yes. So the movement continued. It evolved. It's different. But these issues of police brutality and Confederate iconography are still with us today. Okay? And it has real world consequences. And that's really what the Pensacola book is about. In St. Augustine, it's really interesting because you never hear about St. Augustine in what scholars call the master narrative of the movement. You know, I say that it's the greatest hits of the civil rights movement. You can start with Brown v. Board and you can start ticking them off. Brown v. Board, Emmett Till, Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks, the formation of SCLC, Dr. King's on the stage, 1960, sit-in, 1961, freedom rides, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. St. Augustine's often left out. And when I asked Andrew Young why that's the case, he said because we wanted to forget about St. Augustine. SCLC viewed it as a failure. And they viewed St. Augustine as a failure locally because there was no local negotiation that allowed for race relations to progress on a somewhat more equal status after they left. The law changed it. So they moved out without there being a local compromise that allowed people to live together as equals when they left. To give you and your listeners a point, Susie, I think one of the most telling stats I've ever read about the St. Augustine movement is that it is the only campaign where SCLC spent more money on medical expenses than legal fees. They spent more money on medical care than legal expenses. Not Selma, not Birmingham, not Albany, St. Augustine.
Interesting.
So the fact that they believed, as Dr. King said, and one of the only things he said about St. Augustine after the fact, some communities had to bear the cross for all others. St. Augustine was one of those places.
Well, let's repatriate that experience.
Agreed.
I am a firm believer of that because the more time I spend in the backyard of Jacksonville, I'm impressed with how deep and long this, and to be honest with you, you know, when you said, you know, as a child, your historical passion is, for me, it was the Goonies. Yeah. And so because there were pirate ships, that could have been enough.
That's enough.
But wait, there's more. There's Native Americans, there's expeditions, and there's this rich and beautiful civil rights movement that I agree with you. It's the top 5, right? It's the top 5 hits. So
easily,
we should be doing more tours, shouldn't we? Are we a stop on the tour?
I think we. Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you know, it demonstrates the importance of those connections between groups who may not be like us, but who understand and sympathize and are living witnesses with us. Right? Mm-hmm. On the surface, a young lady from New York and a young man, or an older, much older man, from South Alabama.
Formaldehyde, we're probably the same age.
It doesn't seem like we have a lot in common, but when we start talking about these things, we realize that, yeah, we do. That's why, you know, and I'm going to come back to understanding the primary sources. Mm-hmm. You can have issues with the deliverer, but you can't have issues with the sources themselves. That is the fact. That is the reality. You can distort reality to your own detriment, by the way, because in my opinion, and this is one of the lessons of the movement, right? We demand equality, not because we hate this country, but because we love it and we want it to fulfill the promises it makes to all citizens equally. There is nothing more patriotic the demanding more of your own country and the civil rights movement, in my opinion, fulfills that better than any 20th century topic in American history.
That's an excellent perspective. I really appreciate you saying that. So now it is time for our honorable mensch.
Our honorable.
Yeah, mensch is the Yiddish word for a person of integrity and honor with a sense of what is right and responsible. Would you, Dr. Michael Butler, like to nominate this week's honorary mensch?
I will. Rabbi Merrill Shapiro from the St. Augustine Jewish Historical Society.
Yes.
We have corresponded before, even before I was asked to speak to the group on this important topic. And I think that Rabbi Shapiro, well, no, I don't think, I know. He is one of the key people in making sure that this history is not forgotten, right? He invites someone who looks like me and sounds like me and actually said that he needs to get me in a pulpit after the conversation to make sure that people understand that this history is not a history for just one group of people, but it's a history of who we are as Americans, for keeping this memory alive and making sure that in a time where the easy thing to do may be to ignore it and to talk about pirate ships or conquistadors or things that happened many, many, many years ago that may not be as relevant now, in a time when teaching uncomfortable facts is not exactly welcomed, that we highlight and instead address these topics that connect us all as not just Americans, but as human beings. So I think honorable mensch should absolutely be Rabbi Merrill Shapiro from the St. Augustine Jewish Historical Society.
I had the privilege of taking a walking tour with him, and they offer the tours through the St. Augustine Historical Jewish Society. And I will say this, it is a tenet of Jewish history that we say, V'higadeta bincha. We tell our children, and every year on Passover, we are charged with telling and retelling the story so that we can imagine ourselves as though we had been there. And it is for the purpose of developing empathy up to and including today, not just for people who are like us, but most especially for the people who are not like us, because that is the only way that we can experience success as a society and global citizenship.
I absolutely endorse that. And, on top of that, Rabbi Shapiro, in my opinion, is also an example of someone who is welcoming, accommodating, friendly, and an example of who we should be to our fellow human beings. So it's not just who he is, what he represents, or the fact that he platformed this topic, but it's also the way he made me feel as a guest. And when I spoke to the organization. So for all of those reasons, and as I said to him in an email, as we say in the South, shalom, y'all.
Shalom, y'all. It's been a pleasure and a privilege.
Well, thank you, Susie. Same here.